I don't really understand what you were saying about the thoughts will come from the feelings.
It's like perhaps we need to draw a little diagram or something just to help you with that. I've drawn this before many times, Philippa. So, here's your soul, right? And then here's your spirit body, right? And here's your physical body. The physical body has a brain, which basically physiologically controls the body itself, right? And controls a lot of the essential processes in the body. The spirit body has a mind, right? Where most of your life experience in your first incarnation in particular is stored. So if you're in your first incarnation, the mind stores pretty much most of your experience, as does your soul. Now, remember there's a cord between each one of these things that feeds information from this part to that part, yes? And feeds information through the cord into the next part. Now, most of us were taught this before we even were taught how to think. You were taught how to think by the way in which your parents think. And you were taught how to feel by the way in which your parents feel, right? And that being the case, that means that your mind has become dominant thing in your life. Your parents taught you that your mind should be the dominant thing in your life. But what I'm saying to you is that's not true. What is really true is the so-called subconscious, which doesn't exist at all, but which is actually your soul, which stores all of your emotional experience, is dictating every thought that you have in your mind right now. So if I scratch my nose and someone taught you that scratching someone's nose means they're lying to you, you'll have that thought based on the emotional experience, when the reality is my nose might be just itchy. And that might be the only complication about the reason why I'm scratching it. Does that make sense? We interpret so many things based on what we've been taught intellectually and also, primarily, what's gone on in our soul. So it's what's in our soul. What's in our soul might be, don't trust anybody. So we may have a feeling of mistrust. And then we got taught intellectually by somebody that when a person scratches their nose, it means you can't trust them. And of course, that enters you without any logic, because they could be just scratching the nose because it's itchy, but you think, no, it means you can't trust them, because you've already got emotion inside of you that's open to the thought that anything might be a sign that you can't trust somebody. And so you then automatically become open to that new belief. So your soul, your emotions actually, are determining what you even think right now. Everything you do is determined by your soul's feelings, of which most of us are not conscious. And that's why nowadays a lot of times there's this reference to the subconscious. And what I'm saying is, no, don't think there's a subconscious. There is just conscious and not conscious. Right? And not conscious is you're denying the emotions you feel, but these emotions are still having an input into your day-to-day life. So if you think of your brain like a microprocessor, a CPU, and you've got data in, the data coming in is flawed. So every thought, even the way you think, is flawed. So of course the decisions you make, the things you do, if you could say the choices you make or the decisions you make through your processing intellectually, are going to be flawed. And yet you don't believe they're flawed, you think they're right. But from God's perspective, they're already flawed, because the data coming in is flawed, and the data coming in comes from the soul, and the soul's emotions have been flawed through a process that everyone on the planet basically has gone through, and that is, from the moment you incarnated, you've had imposed upon you the flawed emotions of your parents, and therefore the flawed experiences. Now, their interpretation of those things in the mind is going to be the natural result of whatever flawed reasoning you have in your soul. So what's going on in your mind, even right now, is completely dependent on what's already been input into your soul up until this point. Does that make sense? And And if you can see it that way, you can start to see that if you're going to change, what are you going to have to do? The real thing that most of us are trying to do is we are trying to change our mind. That's what most of us are trying to do. We're trying to go, oh, I've got to do the loving thing here. What's the loving thing? Oh, I don't really know, but I think it's this one. You know, there's our mind. See, our soul, once we've released all its negative emotions, knows instantly what the loving thing to do is. You won't have to think about it, sit down and worry about it for days on end. You'll just do it, right? Because that's the power of your soul. Your soul has the power to express itself emotionally all the time. Does that make sense? All the time. That's where true progression comes from, our soul, not from the mind. But most of us, all we've done when we've heard divine truth is swapped another way of thought for divine truth thinking. And from God's perspective, there is no such thing as divine truth thinking. There is only divine truth feeling. But we've just swapped one method of thinking for another way of thinking. In other words, we're listening to divine truth terminology, but it's just really a thought. It's just really another faith of some kind that is intellectually based. It's not even true faith, because all true faith is based on the soul. So what we've done is we've gone along with this and we've said, right, okay, I've heard all this stuff, sounds good to me. And to be honest with you, if you think back over the 5 or 6 years that you might have heard it, for many of you it hasn't always sounded good to you, right, either, if we're honest. But we go, it sounds good to me, I'll try and do that. But all we're doing is using our mind to attempt something that only, from the way God designed it, can only occur in our soul, in our emotional state. And this is why many of us are not successful. Right? We're not successful because the actual soul transformation doesn't occur. It's just a changing of our minds that has occurred. Right? Does that make sense? So the biggest problem that we face really is this constant idea that has been drummed into us by our environment that the mind is supreme. You even have religious practices today that are all based around the mind being supreme. And you even, like, every time we talk about emotions with members of the media, they get freaked out. Like, honestly, people are so afraid of emotions that they don't even want the media to talk about emotions. They worry that somehow you can be emotionally manipulated. The only time you can be manipulated is when your emotions are out of harmony with what's in your mind. That's the only time you can be manipulated. Right? Now, unfortunately for the majority of us, that's all the time. So we can be manipulated all the time because our emotions are completely out of harmony with what's in our mind. We think one way while at the same time feeling almost completely the opposite emotion. Does that make sense? Now, I first feel that what we need to do is understand the importance of emotions. And what is going to happen to you in your future if you engage the divine truth in the way that God intended you to, which is the way. So if we can call it the way rather than divine truth, the way is basically the soul engaging emotionally. Right? With one addition, engaging emotionally with God. Right? Now, most people have huge difficulties even engaging emotionally, let alone engaging emotionally with God, someone who they don't half the time believe exists, or that they've got a huge amount of emotions about that are negative. Right? But the way is basically emotionally engaging this loving process with God, not intellectually engaging it. In fact, intellectually engaging it is going to be pretty much impossible. God's designed it to be impossible. because your very soul is not intellectual in its nature. And that's why it's impossible. God wants to connect with your soul, not with your mind. God wants to connect with your feelings, your real feelings. So this is where we've got to start asking ourselves, what are our real feelings? What are our real feelings? And we need to be honest about our real feelings if we're ever going to make any progress in the way to God. And most of us are not honest about our real feelings. You know, honesty may happen occasionally in the course of a day. But the rest of the time, we're in total denial of our real feelings most of the time. Yeah. And that's the problem, right? Yeah, that we need to sort out somehow. Now, the first way you sort it out is by changing your belief systems. Right? Now, belief systems can't really change without the soul being engaged. That's sort of the problem. It's like a catch-22. How do I change belief systems that my soul's not engaged to change? And that is our primary problem.